In today's world, people feel lost in a sea of ideas. Which ones should we accept? Stay tuned because you're listening to Veracity Hill, striving for truth on faith, politics, and society. Here is your host, Kurt Jarris.
Well, a good day to you, and thanks for joining us here for another episode of Veracity Hill, where we are striving for truth on faith, politics, and society. So nice to be with you here in the offices of Not Defenders Media. This is a little bit of a nicer setup here. I am coming to you not even from the United States, but I'm joined by my friend Justin Brierley in London, England, at the Premier Christian Radio station. Justin, great to have you on the program today.
It's great to join you, and I'm very happy that we're able to lend our facilities for this special international edition of Veracity Hill.
Yes, thank you. And now this is maybe something different for you.
Mm-hmm.
You are usually the one asking people here, and you're the interviewer.
I am. It's always weird when the tables are turned and I'm being interviewed, because I feel like my natural impulse is to ask the next question, but I have to wait and be asked. Yeah,
and you're giving your answers the times that you have been interviewed. You've given answers, and you know what the follow-up's going to be or should be.
Yeah,
right.
It's funny, but I have to kind of dial that down and just let the person do it in their style, because that may not be my style.
And now
fine.
You've done recently. You've been the subject of interviews because you've come out with a book called Unbelievable: Why After 10 Years of Talking with Atheists, I'm Still a Christian, and this just came out about, I want to say, a year and a half?
More like 2 years ago now,
okay.
Believe it or not, yeah.
Time goes quickly.
So it does. But yeah, it's had a really good reception. I've been really pleased with the kind of the feedback I've had, both from Christians and non-Christians who've read the book. So yeah, it's been great to be able to get stuck into the world of writing and publishing.
For some of the people that follow my program, maybe we should start with an introduction. Who are you, Justin Brierley, and tell us about Unbelievable.
Sure. Well, my official title actually here at Premier Christian Radio is Theology and Apologetics Editor for Premier, because I've been doing the Unbelievable show for 14 years now, believe it or not. Which is very simple, a weekly show where I get a Christian and usually a non-Christian together to discuss faith and belief. That's grown in various ways over the years. So we started a podcast a couple of years in, so it's now listened to around the world, especially in North America, places like that. So it's quite an international audience of both Christians and non-Christians listening. And then we've also, in recent years, been doing a lot more video. So we've got quite a fast-growing YouTube channel that hosts these dialogues and debates. We've got an annual conference here in the UK that we run, which is effectively an apologetics conference with, some big name speakers that we try and bring in each year. And increasingly, we've been doing events overseas as well. So
coming to the States.
Yeah, we've done a couple of Unbelievable conferences in the States. We've done some dialogue events there. I've been invited either to host dialogue events on behalf of other organisations, which we've used for Unbelievable shows, or we've done our own events over there. So that's been exciting, and we do host a lot of US, North American, or other voices from other parts of the world on the show, because it does feel like quite a transatlantic kind of programme. You'll just as likely hear someone like you with your accent than a British accent on Unbelievable. So that's been fun. But alongside that, I've also done other things here. So for 4 years, I was editing our magazine, which Premier Christianity magazine, kind of the equivalent of Christianity Today in the USA, and which was a great experience to edit that. I kind of handed it on a couple of years ago because the stuff with Unbelievable was growing and I felt it needed my full attention. But in addition to that, I've also started a podcast with N.T. Wright, well-known theologian, who you've had on your show, of course. And we call that the Ask N.T. Wright Anything podcast. Comes out once a fortnight. It's just me sitting down with him and asking him a ton of listener questions,
Listener
basically.
submitted.
Yeah,
right.
And it's great fun. And so that's a real joy to do that. And that all keeps me busy. We've had some big projects as well in recent years. Two seasons of The Big Conversation, which is basically Unbelievable, but done to a bit of a higher quality.
The biggest names, sort of,
on
the
biggest
that topic.
names, the
right.
big questions. We got a bit more budget for getting it out through social media, through lots of channels. We put it in our magazines. We put it in different ways in different platforms, and that's really where the drive to really improve what we're doing with video came from as well. So that got off to a real cracking star in 2018. Our very first episode of The Big Conversation from Unbelievable featured Jordan Peterson, who's something of an internet phenomenon. And so that has been far and away our best ever performing video. so the rest are all just trailing in the wake of Jordan Peterson. But we've had some fascinating conversations on that as well.
Let's go back 14 years. Tell me about what got you interested in doing Unbelievable.
Well, I grew up in a Christian family, but I think in my teenage and years, especially university, I certainly came across plenty of objections to Christian faith. It started me on that journey of, I think, just on my own level, investigating apologetics. I didn't even know that word existed, though, at the time. I was just reading people like C.S. Lewis and others, and coming to appreciate some of the rationale for Christianity. But when I started here, having done a degree that lent itself towards journalism, I got into radio, started here at Premier Christian Radio, learnt the ropes, did live radio, created documentaries, things like that.
So you were telling people the traffic and that sort of
Yeah,
thing.
absolutely. I did all my stints, doing travel updates, doing sort of little short journalistic pieces, doing interviews. I was a co-host on our Inspirational Breakfast show for about 3 years. So all of that was great in terms of helping to nurture the idea of what hopefully engaging radio sounds like. But I wanted to eventually to put those principles into action, hopefully in an accessible format of a show that would actually bring Christians and non-Christians together. So I went to the managing director of the station one day and I said, I've got this idea. We do a lot of programs for Christians, about Christianity, great at resourcing Christians, but most of the time people are alongside their non-Christian friends and neighbours. So could we do something where we actually model something on air? And it was a bit of a risk because that meant bringing in non-believers, atheists, skeptics, agnostics, people of other worldviews, Muslims, Hindus, and not everyone liked it. Not all the listeners enjoyed it when we started because they felt like, hey,
you were giving a platform
to these, and that's exactly what we were doing to these objections and skeptical voices. And they said, we've got plenty of those on the BBC. Can't we just keep our nice Christian bubble, skeptic free? But I think there were also enough people who really loved it and said, this is what we need to be doing. We need to be bursting the bubble and acknowledging the fact that this exists, that we felt it was worth pursuing it. And I think people who didn't like it learned to skip it. And the people who did really, made it a listening priority on a Saturday afternoon where it sat in the schedule for 14 years. Now, as I say, that as the technology changed as well and we started podcasting, that opened up a whole new audience on top of that, and that's where we saw a massive growth actually as people from all over the world started listening, both skeptics and Christians. So it's been an exciting journey.
A large following in the United States grew out of the podcasting.
That's right.
Because prior to then, people in the States didn't even know about it.
I mean, we were kind of early adopters as well on the podcasting front. So I think we must have started podcasting in about 2007. And I think we were kind of early on enough in the game that we kind of established ourselves and we became somewhat well known, certainly within those sort of circles of people who are interested in those issues. But it's interesting. I mean, our biggest growth has definitely been in the last 3 or 4 years when we've seen, a lot more people now downloading. It seems to be going almost exponentially growing, which is really exciting.
And while the majority of listeners we think are Christians, you do have a large following of non-believers that listen. And I mean, you designate a section of your program to reading comments. And so from there, we hear there are non-believers.
Oh, yeah. I think you get a sense. I mean, it's very hard to gauge because we're not asking anyone to
what exactly do you believe?
No one sort of gives us their religious affiliations when they download a program or anything. But I think I can tell that there's probably, I don't know, I would say maybe something like a 70-30 split or maybe it's an 80-20 or something. But I think there's a significant contingent of skeptics, people who are interested in these questions, who are watching. I'd say that's even more so now that we're doing a lot more on YouTube, because YouTube is simply populated by a lot of skeptics. It's kind of where a lot of them like to hang out. So if you go into the comment section, you'd think it's probably just skeptics who are maybe watching those discussion programs. But I'm sure to some extent that just reflects the nature of YouTube. But yeah, it's been exciting. And I think one of the most fulfilling things about doing the show has been that you do develop genuine relationships with skeptics and non-Christians who you interact with on a regular basis through email, through the comments, through whatever, who have been following, listening to the show for maybe a decade or more.
Yeah.
I often get people who are, say, I've been listening for, you're the only Christian station I could ever imagine listening to, but I'm still listening, sort of thing. And to see some of those journeys, and I mean, obviously you occasionally do see people go all the way in that journey from skeptic to Christian, and that's wonderful. I love that. I'm a Christian. I want people to believe. But even sometimes just a change in attitude towards Christianity is something you begin to see in some of those cases. And so for me, it's a really encouraging thing to do that.
I was going to ask you, so have you built any relationships where people have gone from a non-believer to a Christian because of that? And are these people you knew personally, and then they started listening to the program, or just people, your listeners, that have provided that testimony?
It's very much a combination. So when we have seen people, and I would say, firstly, Unbelievable is never the only thing that's obviously at play. There's going to be all kinds of other influences going on. But for people for whom the show has been significant in some way towards their journey of conversion, I mean, there's people who I have never met in person, but who have emailed me or told me their story in some other way, and that's wonderful. So there's listeners in the US and other parts of the world who have got in touch to tell me about that. One person I do know and is a friend of mine, a guy called Peter Byram, who you may know a little.
Yes, Peter.
But Peter's journey, I remember when I first started seeing him pop up in an old chat room that we had at one time for Unbelievable. This is fairly early on, and he was on there as an atheist, a skeptic, but one who I could tell was kind of open to hearing other arguments, and as I saw this progress, he emerged. He'd become quite disillusioned with some of the new atheist narratives and rhetoric, to the point where eventually I invited him on the show, and we had he came on as the skeptic, and I think we were doing a discussion on original sin or something like that. That was the thing.
My field of study.
There you go. I should have had you on with him, but I honestly can't remember much of the details of the show. It was a long time ago, but partly through that and other things, he had already also finding some William Lane Craig stuff really helpful. In the end, Peter ended up just in a kind of voluntary capacity actually helping with some of the technical arrangements for a tour we did with Bill Craig in the UK back in 2011.
When I lived here for the year.
Exactly.
Yeah. That's
so,
right.
And then it was on that tour, actually, as Peter was involved with it, that he actually kind of crossed the line and became a Christian. And now Peter is very much involved himself in various forms of apologetics, but Christian ministry generally. Yeah. And so that's just a lovely story where I've been friends with someone for whom the show has been significant.
All right, let's flip it now.
Yeah.
Have you known someone who's a Christian, but because of the show is no longer a Christian?
I can't say that I know anyone who would directly say the show was the deciding factor, but I've certainly met plenty and come across many who would say, I've been on a journey of questioning out of this, and your show hasn't convinced me otherwise, or indeed I've sided more with the skeptics on your show. Now, for me, that for me is something where obviously I'm disappointed if I feel like you don't feel the evidence as...
You don't want to be a responsible factor.
You don't. There's a responsibility on me to make sure that I am bringing together responsibly both sides in ways that are not going to harm. But at the same time, I feel responsible for making sure that it is a level playing field. I'm not just going to bring on Christians with very weak atheist voices who can easily, win the argument. Because, atheists aren't going to actually want to listen to that because they won't feel they're being taken seriously or respected. So I kind of have to leave the results up to the individuals and God, and trust that somewhere in the mix things are happening that God is ordaining, or that I'm just happy to leave it to people to make their own minds up and believe that, and trust that God is working in that process.
There's only so much one person could do, and so if you're, let's say it's a debate that you're hosting. I mean, it's not a weekly program, but let's say there's a debate you've got. If there are going to be some people in the audience that are going to give up their Christian faith because you put on this debate in a church, I mean, it's like you can't really be all that responsible.
Yeah, exactly. And for me, I feel like you're only a Google click away from some pretty radically skeptical views. So it's not like we're kind of suddenly revealing something that is not very accessible already. But at least in the context of a show discussion, you're going to hear hopefully a cogent response to those issues. Whereas online, you very rarely get that kind of balance.
And as you mentioned, there are typically other factors at play here.
Absolutely.
I mean, if someone's faith is going to just plummet because they hold to a certain view of inerrancy or something like that, and they give it all up, there were clearly issues. The church failed, the family failed, other things that are going on then.
And it's interesting because I never see any story as the end of the line either. So even when I've had some people in the past say, I've lost my faith, I feel like, I haven't heard anything on the show that's persuaded me otherwise. It's interesting, even recently I've had conversations with people who are now coming out of that. They're kind of doing some kind of reconstruction after the deconstruction. So I never want to say, fine, that's it. Your story's over.
Right.
But for me, I don't know. I just don't get too worried. I kind of have quite a deep trust that I'm not responsible for anyone's eternal destiny, personally. I will do what I can faithfully to what I feel God's called me to do. But I'm very happy to leave people in God's hands and trust that he is far more just and merciful than I can ever be in terms of knowing, every person, inside out. And so I as long as I feel we're doing what we're called to do here in terms of creating a space for dialogue for people who need to think through these issues in the way that the show does, then I don't get too worried. Whatever the balance looks like, as far as it appears to me, of where people are going with it.
Yeah. Now, most of your programs are presenting a Christian and non-Christian view. There's only so much you could say, though. And sometimes you get creative and you have two Christians talking about a theological topic, but there are rarer cases, but sometimes almost more intriguing when you have two non-Christian voices debating some subject.
Yeah. I think I'm very open to doing that when it feels like there's just a subject that can exist perfectly well in that, but which both Christians and non-Christians will learn something from. Maybe a case in point.
I think of Tom Holland.
Yeah, the Tom Holland and AC Grayling debate, and Tom Holland hasn't. I'd say isn't wearing any faith on his sleeve at this point. I mean, I'm not going to say that couldn't change at some point in the future, but he's a secular historian, basically. He's written a book, Dominion, on the way that Christianity has shaped the modern world. And in that sense, lots of Christians have been very enthusiastic about this book because it's kind of going against the typical atheist narrative.
Religion is a poison.
Religion is a poison. Yeah. It's, it gave us the Dark Ages and everything else. So, and he's had a lot of pushback for writing this book from the atheist community. So he's no friend at this point of the atheist community that he's often, sat down with and done other discussions with. I saw a video from a few years ago where he was at the British Humanist Convention doing a discussion alongside other people. So I had him on with atheist AC Grayling, who's a lot more on the new atheist side of things and very much disagrees with Tom's thesis. But yeah, that's a good example where I see that as a perfectly valid discussion to have, even though neither side is professing a faith in that particular instance. And we've had at least a few others where that has been the case. We've even had some funny shows where I've got them to swap positions. I did one with Randall Rouser and Michael Roos, where I actually got Randall to play the atheist and Michael Roos to play the Christian, and both try to give the best arguments they could. Which was an interesting experiment, and I enjoyed doing that show. And kind of forced each person to, the term I think is to steelman the other person's position. Yeah. And I thought that was a good exercise, actually. Yeah. Not that you'll find that many probably Christians and atheists willing to do that, because it goes against everything inside you to kind of be making the case for the opposition. But
that's right.
It worked. They were both up for it and did a good job.
Yeah. Okay, so you've had so many different interviews and discussions and debates that you have facilitated, and after so many years, you're still a Christian. You've written a book, you've provided the evidences, you tell your stories of the people you've met and whatnot. I do want to ask you, are there subjects, and I know there's at least one, are there subjects where you have changed your mind?
Yeah.
on
I mean,
some subject.
definitely. I mean, to be honest, when I got into this, there were some things I hadn't even thought about to realize that there was a position to take on it. So you kind of learn as you go along, just where all the boundary markers lie and that kind of thing. So it's been a theological education as much as anything in the course of doing the show over 14 years. But yeah, I mean, I'd say there's definitely places where through doing the show, having guests on, I've definitely taken a position where I maybe didn't have one before, I just sort of agnostic on it, or where I've changed a position from what I had before. Probably a good example, one I mentioned in the book, is growing up, I certainly would have held to a kind of eternal hell kind of conscious eternal punishment kind of view. That I definitely am far more in line with, I guess, an annihilationist position now. And that for me, I think, to give him his credit, Chris Date, I think made a very powerful argument biblically for that, because a lot of people think people just shift to that kind of on a purely kind of, I don't like the idea of eternal conscious torment. But I think people like Chris, who has this whole project called Rethinking Hell, has done a great job actually at showing why this is a historic position the church has taken, and why biblically it makes sense in so many ways. And I found myself very persuaded by that. And philosophically and theologically, I find it more compatible with the way I understand God's character and that kind of thing. So that's been one place where I'd say I'm very happy to say I've changed my position. I think just my appreciation of the way the New Testament especially has come together, and the way the genre of different parts of the New Testament work, and has really been helped by people like N.T. Wright, Mike Licona and others. I probably, and that's not that I've changed my mind radically, it's more just that I've gained a deeper appreciation of what the Bible is. And I probably have less of a, as when I came in, a kind of idea that it sort of fell out of the sky, kind of ready-made for us to kind of be able to just use as a sort of rule book. I think that's just really, though, part of what it is to learn a bit more of a mature approach to Scripture and the way that we use it and understand it. And so yeah, there's been definitely, journeys along the way as I've gone.
Who have been some of your favorite guests to host on the program?
Favorite guests? I mean, in terms of Christian apologetics, I love people like John Lennox. He's just a delightful, winsome guy. He's a great communicator, but also, a really sharp mind. So it's always a pleasure to have someone like John Lennox join me on the show. I'm hugely influenced by N.T. Wright, and which is part of the reason why I started a podcast of its own with him.
Yeah.
And so I mean, like many people, he's been massively influential in helping me to understand the whole scope of Scripture and what it means to be a Christian in the modern world. And very excited to have him at this year's Unbelievable conference, actually, in London in May. So those would be two like top guests, that I would say on the Christian side. On the atheist side, on the skeptical side, I always enjoy having Bart Ehrman on. He comes through town every so often. He's got family over here in the UK, so I've been able to get him in studio quite frequently. And while I disagree, obviously, with a number of the positions he takes, he's always genial, and he kind of approaches these things in a kind of in a friendly way. In my studio, at least, he's always kind of been very up for having these kinds of conversations.
And yeah, he's I had a chance to spend some time with him in October at the Defenders Conference. He's very civil. He's a former Christian, so he understands the culture. Yeah. In some ways, though, he's also learning new things. So after our event, he noted that Christian apologetics has taken on what he called an intellectually sustainable form of discourse. Yeah. And so I think he's learning more about this as well.
And I think to some extent that's so encouraging to hear. And I saw, some of the comments coming out from the Defenders Conference. And in a way, I'm glad he's tapped into the fact that, apologetics has moved on from probably what he
from just
saw
Bible
it as,
thumping.
When he was in Moody or whatever.
That's right.
There was a kind of probably very, an idea of it he had, and I'm glad that's been challenged in some way. I was interested to see, actually, he'd blogged recently even on his own sort of atheism slash agnosticism, saying that he had a kind of mystical experience almost when he was doing some meditation recently, and realized that it would be hugely arrogant to claim that there is no God, given the limitations of, say, between us and even our closest.
He draws a distinction
primate.
between knowing and believing.
Yeah.
So you can't say...
So again, I think, fair play to Bart. He's willing to put it out there when he says, I've changed my mind, or yeah.
Okay, so those are some of your favorite guests, if I may.
Yeah.
Who have been some of your more difficult?
Ooh. Difficult guess. I mean, there are some shows which have, almost been train wrecks because of the characters you have on are so difficult.
If you get two guys heated in studio.
Absolutely, yeah. In this studio, I remember one where I had a Muslim guest on in studio, and on the phone coming in on it, I think it was Robert Spencer, who's a very quite an anti-Islamic kind of commentator, and they just ended up trading insults, and it got to the point where I had to sort of pause the recording and say, guys, we've got to, I can't put
calm
this
down
out if you don't calm down, because they're just talking over each other and everything. And you get that as well, where people are passionate.
Yep.
It's not necessarily that they're trying to be rude, but they won't let each other. I had a recent one with Steve Chalke and Phil Moore debating Steve Chalke's new book on Paul. And Steve, bless him, I like him a great deal, but he, in that instance, he did a lot of interrupting, and it was hard to hear each other if one side was interrupting too much, and Phil then had to kind of come back, and he was quite forceful, so you ended up being quite difficult to manage, and not necessarily the greatest listening experience for a lot of people. And there was one classic episode where we were debating homosexuality, which is always a highly charged issue anyway, but in this case it was Robert Gagnon, who's quite a vociferous critic of people who see the Bible as being open on homosexuality or anything like that. And Jane Ozanne, who's a person who sort of champions LGBT issues in the Christian church and so on. And it was just one of those ones where it was just potentially the wrong match of people, because they approached it in such different ways that it just got really difficult and uncomfortable in the studio. And as much as there's a place for drama, and I felt like it almost got oppressively kind of, in that studio, I didn't know quite where to go because it got so uncomfortable at points. But you live and learn.
So in those situations, you're not just the interviewer / moderator, you're also a counselor.
Yeah, I think you're trying to create something that's, you want a bit of drama. There's, I don't want everyone to constantly agree with each other on the show.
Yeah, who would listen to that?
Exactly. But at the same time, if it tips over into being too aggressive, or it can be difficult, I think, for people to listen to. There's some people who won't even listen to Unbelievable because they just don't like really hearing dialogue that has a conflict element to it, and that's fine. But even for me, as someone who enjoys hearing two perspectives kind of duking it out, there are points at which I will be like, that's uncomfortable listening if it kind of just tips over the line into being too aggressive or whatever. So my job is to just try and keep things on a level where if it feels like someone's getting the upper hand too much, I might then toss something to the other side so that we can move the conversation on, and it doesn't feel like anyone's kind of being backed too much into a corner at any one point. Yeah.
You've been doing the program now for 14 years. Are there any episodes you still have on the bucket list? Topics you want to cover, guests you'd like on?
Plenty, yeah. And listeners constantly send them in as well. So there's always interesting new, angles on topics we may have done before, interesting people who are coming up with new theories. The big atheist that I haven't yet been able to get on but would love to is Sam Harris. I think he's got a huge audience, and I would love to have him on and just have someone really good opposite him to discuss some of those big issues around neuroscience, free will, consciousness, some of the things he's so well known for. But there's almost any number of topics actually that you could do with Sam Harris and get a really interesting show out of it. There's there's always people coming up on my radar. I think there's some really exciting young Christian apologists that I want to give profile to, who are, really actually also on the ball when it comes to the new technology and the way things are getting out there.
Yeah, the Christian YouTubers.
Yeah, absolutely. I think though, that's the next generation now of, the people who were the Sean McDowells and the others who maybe we're going to see the fruits of what they started in these young men and women. So I'm excited.
I'm sure Sean loves being part of the older generation now.
I was actually thinking of Josh McDowell, not Sean McDowell. Josh McDowell being the old. No, Sean is definitely on the young. Hey, we're practically the same age, so we're both definitely young. But no. If I said Sean, I meant Josh.
You meant Josh. Got it.
Because I think Josh himself would say, he's kind of part of an older generation of apologists and so on.
Yeah.
Whereas, there's a lot of guys who are coming in with more of a
Yep. All right, let me ask you final question. Tell me about your 10 minutes with Richard Dawkins.
10 minutes with Richard Dawkins. So I'd wanted to get Richard Dawkins on the show for a while. The show launched around the time that the God Delusion came out, and that was a big deal at the time. And Dawkins, one of the most famous atheists in the world, I'd made advances to his publishing company and everything. Nothing had come back really. And then I saw he was going to be having a debate. This is going back to, I think, 2008 in Oxford with John Lennox. It was one of that series of debates that Dawkins and Lennox had. And so I went to the Oxford Natural History Museum to be an observer of that. I went to the little press conference afterwards, got to ask a couple of questions there, but still hadn't had an interview really with Dawkins, and I was really interested in doing that. Well, what should happen? But that when I left the venue to go to the college where they were doing a kind of after show party, who should I find myself next to walking down the road but Richard Dawkins? He was pushing his bike along. He gets around on bicycle in Oxford. And I introduced myself and said, I'd love to get a chance to interview you later, if possible, if there's a chance during the reception. And he said, oh, yes, that's fine. Who do you represent? And I said, Premier Christian Radio. And said, he seemed very dubious at that point of my credentials, said, oh, okay, well, we'll see. And anyway, as it turned out, there was an opportunity. I managed to step in and just have, about 10, 15 minutes with him in this very busy, crowded environment. But we had a great chat, and I was kind of really nervous stepping into it because I was like, what do I ask Richard Dawkins? I've got 10 minutes here. So we covered some ground on the discussion he had with John Lennox. And there was one really interesting moment, though, during that discussion, which kind of got picked up on by a number of blogs and things at the time, but where we ended up talking about human value and where, on an atheistic worldview, where does it come from? And I essentially asked him the question, if all that's going on is a kind of blind evolutionary process, if we'd evolved to believe that rape is okay, would that mean that rape is okay? And he kind of ummed and ahed a bit about that question, but said, nothing about what we end up believing makes it more probable that there's a God. I said, okay, but the point, I said, in the end, the fact that we've evolved to believe rape is wrong is as arbitrary as the fact that we've developed 5 fingers rather than 6. And he ended up saying, yes, it is basically like that. And I just thought that was a very telling moment in that particular conversation where he was saying, I don't like it, but yes, we don't. There's no particular right or wrong about the morals we've evolved. It just is what it is. And that I think is a consistent but problematic position to take in atheism, because for me the moral argument is a very powerful one. We find in ourselves this sense that there really is a rightness and wrongness to the way we act, to the way we value other people, that it isn't simply whatever evolution happens to have handed us, that there's a real right or wrong about this. And for me, that's always been a strong indicator that we have this moral sense that comes from somewhere beyond us. And for me, that's something I try to spell out in the book as well.
Yes. So you provide those evidences, the explanations, also stories such as the Richard Dawkins parents and some others as well. Again, the book is Unbelievable. Why I, after 10 years of talking with atheists, I'm still a Christian. I have to read it. It's kind of a longer subtitle. Put out by SBCK. We'll put a a link to the book at our website, so you can purchase the book as well. And great, very accessible read as well. Nothing all that high level at all, despite what the scientific formula is on the chalkboard in the background.
It's very much aimed at people who aren't necessarily into apologetics, but might find that there are some helpful thoughts and arguments in there.
But that is the role of the apologist, to
Absolutely.
bring that material down to the lay level. Justin, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so
on
much,
the program
Kurt.
today.
It's been a delight. Thank you.
All right, well, that does it for the program. I'm grateful for the continued support of our patrons. Those are folks that just chip in a few bucks each month to help us continue to go and grow. And also the partnerships that we have with our sponsors. They are Defenders Media, Consult Kevin, The Sky Floor, Rethinking Hell, the Illinois Family Institute, Fox Restoration, and I want to thank our technical producer. Today it's Adam. Who came in and helped out with the video. And, of course, you'd set up the audio. And to our guest, Justin Brierley, and for Premier Christian Radio that we could use the studio today. But as with every weekly program, last and certainly not least, I want to thank you for listening in and for striving for truth on faith, politics, and society.
You've been listening to Veracity Hill, striving for truth on faith, politics, and society. This is a listener-supported program. For more resources, including past shows, visit veracityhill.com.